Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Cougar from the Veterans Office. I'm also here to represent our mayor. I have a citation which I will read in a second here from her. I'd like to say thank you to everyone that was part of the group. We are absolutely humbled and honored to the writers group for choosing the photo of the cover to be the Office of Veteran Services, and that is just a remarkable honor, and we are truly honored, so thank you for that. I came in the office in March of 14, so I've had the honor of attending a couple of the readings over the past couple of years, and I've listened to the families talk about what it was like on the home front back here during the war. I've listened to veteran stories in a different time as how they traveled across the country to attend boot camp, and I've listened to the poems and writings of our various veterans. Some who have unfortunately passed. Two of them who are noted, and I'd like to make note of both of them, Mel Olson and Thomas Serafine, who are great friends of our office and part of the writers group. They are missed but never forgotten. Because of the writings in this book, their memories and the memories of all of you who took part in this book are forever ingrained in our Cape Ann community. It is one thing to share your story. It is another to encapsulate it into a book, because now it is forever part of our great Cape Ann history. So thank you all for this invitation. I'd like to read the citation from the mayor at this time. Office of the Mayor, special citation for the Gloucester Writers Center and the Cape Ann Veterans Writers Group, supporting the debut of Cape Ann Veterans Anthology, The Inner Voice, and the Outer World writings by local veterans and families. As mayor of the city of Gloucester, one of the pleasures of office is the opportunity to recognize, in an official way, special happenings in the lives of our residents. Thus, I am delighted to take a moment to recognize the Cape Ann Veterans Writers Group for their contributions to this historic anthology, as assisted through the support of the Cape Ann Veterans Services and the Gloucester Writers Center. The Cape Ann Veterans Writers Group, their families, and supporters have been an important presence in Gloucester's community. The strength and courage displayed by those who shared their stories, and for the years of exemplary service our veterans have provided, is something that the city of Gloucester does not take for granted. On behalf of the city of Gloucester, I extend my warmest gratitude to all those who helped contribute and create this remarkable published work series, notably the Cape Ann Veterans Writers Group, their families, and all who aided in the creation of this historic anthology, a reality, along with our sincere congratulations, given under my signature and seal of the City of Gloucester this 10th day of December 2017, Safathia Romeo Taken, Mayor.
So now how is the program going to go on? Each reader will read for less than 5 minutes, hopefully. Those who are reading from their prose narrative has chosen brief excerpts. Those who are reading poems will read their entire poem. I will be reading two of mine later on in the two of my excerpts later on in the program. This book is organized in part by the various wars that have affected people in our groups: Iraq, Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. Some have writings in more than one section of this book. The first story was written by Alma Hart, whose son was killed in Iraq in 2003. She is working on a book for military families. A chapter of her book is included in this anthology, and unfortunately, Alma won't be able to join us today. So we'll begin with the Vietnam era readings first. The readers will let us know the title of their work and something briefly about themselves. So the first one to come up is Gregg.
Hi, my name is Jim Gregg. I grew up in Gloucester, graduated in Gloucester High in '65, joined the Marines in '65 to '69, spent '66 and '67 in Vietnam. I'd like to do a few poems. One of them is not in the book. And it's an important thing to remember that even though we've had veterans that died in the war, some of the ones that died after the war was even a more macabre deal than it is to be lost in combat. They call it lost friends. Most every night they visit me, 3 friends from days gone by, reminding me that all's not well, their life is gone awry. All 3 came home from Vietnam, their sanity self-queried. You're crazy, man, you've lost your mind, their rambling thoughts all hurried. No welcome back, these 3 Marines, no good to see you, boys. Just ridicule and stinging jeers discarded like broken toys. They tried to accept the bitterness, the constant taunting by the masses. Their country flipped upside down, its people turned to asses. Spit upon and called baby killers, they just wanted to live their life, but found it very hard to do with this constant, unending strife. They took to drink to drown the past and calm their raging mind, reaching for peace, serenity, a place they could not find. All 3 have since passed this life, a life they could not live. They gave the call their fullest, now there's nothing left to give. They tap upon my window pane to let me know they're there, to beckon me to join with them, to Valhalla soon so near. Last summer, I was in West Springfield for the moving wall, and I listened to a few people that were there. And I came up with this because there were soldiers and Marines, Air Force, that only were known by their nicknames. So I wrote this, Among the Names. I met him there at the wall that heals, they claim. He looked confused, and I asked what's wrong. Could I help? I wouldn't mind. He looked at me and slowly muttered, I can't find my friend. He died in Nam. I never knew his name. We called him Chief, a quiet guy, an Indian from New Mexico, I think. In the paddies of Vietnam, he saved my ass. The price he paid was his. He beckons me. I know it's here on the wall. It cries out to be released. I fear I'll never find it. Perhaps in death we'll meet again. Thank you for your time. And then I wrote one that's, seems like all the wars are the same, whether it's World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. The scenarios are always the same. And I call this one, The Birds Still Sing. Listen to the birds singing, breaking this pastoral silence, unaware that hell will soon break loose. In just minutes, barely enough time to reread a cherished letter or glance at a worn picture. Not a word is spoken, just waiting for the signal, the shrill alarm, and then clamber up the walls of this rat-infested hole and trudge through this quagmire they call a field, that once soil that bore fruit abundant, past barbed wire into no man's land, living hell, afraid but never questioning, our turn on the offensive, the mind awry with thoughts in this muddy pasture of hell, parked and upheaved with craters, body parts strewn about like seeds in the wind, rats tearing at the flesh left from the onslaught days ago. Our ravenous machine guns cutting down men as wheat with a scythe. Artillery shells bursting above, raining down razor-sharp steel, biting into soul and body, wreaking havoc. Hundreds wounded and killed, forced into retreat back into their holes. Many lost, nothing gained, but in the wire above the trenches, a bird still sings. I have one more that I wrote for a friend, fellow student in the writing group that we were in, Mel Olson, who passed away. And I call it Mel's Words. These words he chose to wake the mind, a barrier to climb, decipher. Another sunset missed as he searched in depth the movement of the sky. But days went by unknowing what path that led to his demise. He wrote so carefully precise of war and brotherhood, of icy winds and misery. Such words he penned in a hurried pace, yet darkness fell so unexpected, too soon the stars appeared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Now I'd like to hear from Heather DuPont. Come on up, Heather.
Thanks.
Stand a little closer to the mic so people can hear, okay?
I will. Good afternoon. I worked with military veterans for 20 years in mental health. In my writing, I only use actual names of veterans when I have their permission. Otherwise, the names are changed. In the piece, one piece, Getting By, that's in the book, those names have been changed. That's from, those vets are from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars or conflicts. I also have a poem about some Vietnam War vets, and their names are there with their permission. And today I'm going to read a poem titled War Dance. This poem is in the form of a villanelle, which is based on a European folk dance. So it has repeating lines and it has a rhyme scheme. And I chose the title because for me it incorporated not just the form of the poem, but the dance of the therapeutic process and the dance of patience. John Rogers died on his 80th birthday. He was an unrecognized hero of the Korean War. He had post-traumatic stress syndrome before that term was ever made a diagnosis, so he never got any treatment for it. I had the honor of giving him a framed copy of this poem that I wrote. He was thrilled. He showed it to his daughters. It helped them to reconnect, talking about it. He was able to talk about his time in Korea. And he asked me to share it with as many people as possible, that it might help other veterans and help their families and help with reconnecting. So this is War Dance from Unchong, 1952, for John Julius Rogers, September 23rd, 1929 to September 23rd, 2009. He brought chocolates and a flower today. He knows there's no romance, doesn't pretend, but hopes I'll listen to what he has to say. He knows family and reason are slipping away. His friends have passed on from that war, he contends, then hands me a book with a photograph today. He brags, I was quite a ladies' man back in the day, but the photo shows 2 houseboys with him and his men. He wants me to see what he's trying to say. They fought smart, played light, outran the sun's rays, a camaraderie nourished by both boys and the men. He brought letters and songs from yesterday. In our camp, he boasts, there were no feet of clay. We were tough. His brimming eyes give way again. He needs me listening to what he must say. We were ambushed by mercenaries, our camp betrayed. They cut off the heads of those boys. The caged men watched helpless. He brought chocolates today. He knows I'll listen to what he needs to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Now it's my turn. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a veteran of the United States Air Force, 1967 to 1971. I served in Northeast Thailand at a forward combat support base from 1970 to 71. My first one is called On the Karat Plateau. It takes place in April 1970. During hot refueling, these are just excerpts from my story. During hot refueling, the jets are checked for damage and the pilot is refreshed, and the crew chief and pilot pass information. Once the F-4 is fully loaded with fuel, the crewman disconnects the nozzle from the jet and hands it to me. Once the pilot is cleared to move, he taxis to have his plane armed with bombs and missiles. The 4 jets then taxi to the runway off to their target. Before the refueling is complete, 4 more F-4s are landing and heading to the hot refuel location. This goes on 12 hours a day for a week. The bombing of Cambodia is a 24-hour effort. The night operation is slower and the rotation takes place at the bunkers for the jet. Next morning, hot refueling begins at 7 a.m. While sitting on the tarmac, leaning against the rear wheels of my fuel truck to take advantage of what shade there is, my mind wanders, and I begin to question the morality of the war in ways I hadn't before. Back in the States, it was all practice. The fighters went to a bombing range, returned home, no one killed. Now the number killed is unknown. Now sitting here on the tarmac against the tire of the truck, it has become too real. The 24/7 bombing of a country that was perceived threat to the United States seemed profoundly wrong in my mind. The war would go on. I did my part, but the hidden sadness of the involvement will last throughout my life. After my tour of Karat, my next assignment was Homestead Air Force Base, where I was assigned to Air Force One and Marine One when President Nixon came to Florida. In addition to Homestead, had a detachment of F-106s to protect the 2 nuclear-armed B-52s that they would scramble when a Cuban MiG tested our airspace. We also did hot refueling from time to time for the permanent party of F-4s, which was more training for the pilots than for the ground crew. The big difference between doing this in Florida and Karat was there was often only 4 jets, always unarmed. In Florida, I felt I was serving my country in addition to my assignment to Air Force One and Marine One. What helped me was knowing that my mission in Karat supported the ground troops in their success. The next one is called Being Heard, Notes on Coming Home. Those of you who are Vietnam vets will probably relate to this. We all suffered this one. Over the years, I met many who did not think that any veteran should be treated well. I know that my experience as a Vietnam vet is similar to others. Things gradually changed, and veterans are greeted in a much better way. I am embarrassed to have a stranger come to me who sees me wearing my veteran's cap to shake my hand and say, "Thank you for your service." The first few times, I didn't know what to say. In my mind, I thought, yeah, sure, not long ago you would have called me some derogatory name. I still don't know why people do this, but I try to accept the gratitude and say you're welcome. I have become to be proud of my service. I have even led lay services on Veterans Day at my church. I sometimes wear a hat stating my service as a Vietnam vet. It has taken years for me to be able to do this. There was never much support to tell stories of my service time. Most people don't want to know or just don't care. Their thank you seems to be it. Then one day I saw a notice in the paper about a veteran writers workshop at the local Veterans Center. I was interested but skeptical, and was it really for vets? Would the instructor really want to assist vets in telling their stories? I wanted to write my military memoir for my family, so I went. This Veterans Writers Workshop evolves with each new session different than the prior, spring or fall. Daughters, wives, and mothers of veterans write their experience, and vets write theirs, whether at peacetime or wartime. These varying perspectives all tell an important story of the American experience. It is now a different world for veterans from how we were treated by the public. VA facilities to businesses that happily offer us discounts. As I say when I conclude a veteran service at my church, if you have a veteran in your life, on this day, let them finish their story, even if you've heard it many times before. Sometimes a vet needs more than a thank you for your service. They need to be heard. Thank you. So now I'd like to ask Stan Fina to come up.
Speak right into the microphone. That'd be good.
Huh? He's worried he's going to miss his next Santa cake.
Well, as Ed announced, my name is Stan Fina, and I'm a Gloucester boy who had the good fortune to enlist in the Marine Corps. So let's hear it for the Marines. And I will acknowledge that the Marines were part of the Department of the Navy, but that's as far as I'll go. I've written pieces about my military experience, and I also felt liberated enough to retreat to my childhood and recall things that I thought were important, or things that would be interesting to my children, things they probably didn't know about me. Not that there's a heck of a lot to know, you know. I go ho, ho, ho every December. But so I thought I would read the first one, which is about trains, in a way. It's called The Train Ride. It's about the train that left South Station loaded with recruits for the Marines and all the things that happened on the journey. I'm just going to read a little bit from this. My fascination with trains began at the end of the age of steam in the 40s. When I was a boy, you could hear their whistles all over Cape Ann. And if you were lucky enough to be at the train station, when one came rumbling in with billows of steam momentarily obscuring you from view as the platform shook beneath your feet, the excitement was almost too much to bear. But by the end of the decade, steam had been supplanted by diesel engines, and the experience, at least for those of us under age 12, was greatly diminished. I'm going to read something in its entirety because it's short, and this is not a military piece. This is a piece of my personal history. It's called Spectacles. The first notice came when I was in the 4th grade, then again in the 5th, and the 6th. They all sounded alike. Stanley should visit an optometrist. He's having difficulty seeing the blackboard. I've moved him toward the front of the classroom. On the surface, an innocuous piece of paper, not unlike many other such notices, at best considered harmless and well-intended by those whose names, other than mine, were on the notice. First off, I was conflicted, not because I might be deficient in some manner, but rather that I had been targeted by the teacher, rousted out of my comfortable seat in the back corner, and made to sit up front with the kids who actually wanted to be close to the teacher. I had nothing in common with them, neither socially nor academically. It was a total embarrassment. Secondly, it upset my mother and father. My father said it was too bad, and in a rare display of pragmatism, offered the unhelpful opinion that there was nothing to be done. The household budget couldn't bear the burden of eyeglasses in the short term, and maybe not in the long term. And since I was now seated closer to the blackboard, the issue was being handled by the school. "There we go," he said, "problem solved." This news was not well received by either me or my mother. And periodically she cried, as she did too often in her life, about my father's dismal confusion. But, you know, we came from a family where the father was the final authority. My mother coped by budgeting the cost of the cheapest pair of glasses she could find, laying aside money each week, mostly coins. When I was starting the 6th grade, after yet another notice, the day finally arrived when I was marched to Main Street to the offices of George Cohen, the optometrist. After waiting impatiently for over a week, I gazed. Corrected vision was mine. What a wonder that was to me. The clarity of vision that I'd been lacking these past 3 years left me astonished. I stared at my mother's face as if seeing her for the first time. I thought, how beautiful she is. My heart was bursting. The years of scrimping and saving had paid off. Stanley could now see 20/20. More surprises were awaiting me when we came down the long flight of stairs from the 2nd floor. I could actually see street signs. Across Main Street were Broad Shoe Store and the Cape Ann Savings Bank. They faced Kresge's, Nick's Pool Hall, TikTok Donuts, and Wright's Card Shop. To my left, on my side of the street, I remember Gillis's Barber Shop, Fanny Farmer Candies, Sterling Drugstore, Woolworths, and W.G. Brown's 3-level department store. The Gloucester Delicatessen was opposite, as was the A&P, and next to the Delicatessen was Kennedy's Butter and Egg store. And others I remember were Empire Clothing, Adasco, and Bob's Haberdashery. And I just remembered another one, Clicky's Men's Shop. Well, anyhow, if I've got anything wrong in my recounting, I want everybody who's raised in Gloucester to feel free to correct me, but not too harshly. And that's the end of that piece. Finally, I wrote a poem, which is not about military experience, but actually it's about these cufflinks. And the poem is called My Grandfather's Cufflinks. The cufflinks belonged to my mother's father. She gave them to me, her eldest son. They have lain unused for too many years, since I fear their loss would break a trust that links me to a person I've never known, save from an old taped wedding photograph and my mother's few stories of childhood, and these 2 pieces of mute, well-worn gold. When did he wear them? To Mass each Sunday, on occasions of honor or sadness? And I'll turn the page in just a minute. Did he stand stiffly with the same look of dignified pride as in his wedding picture? There's no one to ask. Though I fret and stare, the links are silent, keeping their secrets, their future and mine imponderable. My life's end draws near. What of my legacy? Will it rival these? Thank you.
So now I'd like to ask Dr. Susan Fry to come up and read hers. Come on. You have something to read. Try and stand close to the mic.
Right. I'm going to caress this microphone. Anyway, I know this was an oversight, but I just wanted to add that one of the veterans that has passed since our writing workshop was a good friend of mine, Melvin DeVoe, and his dedication is in the anthology, and I know it was oversight on the Veterans Association, whatever. Whatever, right. So in one of his writings, Tom Sullivan had referenced an article in the Gloucester Daily Times in 2016, which said, World War I has done more to shape our modern world than any other event of the 20th century. Which is an interesting comment because you know the slogan that was associated with World War I was the war to end all wars. So that statement is now used very sardonically because we know after 30 million casualties from World War I, we went into World War II with 90 million. At any rate, so Susan Fry, Vietnam War, 68 to 70. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote that actually has reference to World War I in terminology. Those of us from my vintage, and I can see a lot of us white hairs out there, remember the poem by John McCrae, In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row to row. So I actually, in what I'm going to share with you was a poem that I wrote in tribute to World War I, although it has universal applications to all who have passed over into from this energy spectrum. But anyway, in Flanders Field, I always thought in my uneducated mind that Flanders Field was actually a place. And I got to go visit this place in Europe. But it was a common English term for the battlefield. Flanders Field is the battlefield. And the poppies that grew were the only botanical that would survive in the arid wasteland. My poem is called Reciprocity, and I said it has universal application to all who have passed over. Right now, in a moment of space-time, what is mine is yours, even before we speak of it. All is well or not, as the world advances and retreats in total harmony. History reveals unequivocally that species thrive and then abruptly disappear into a vast, expanding universe where all share the same field. Mark your place, knowing we will cradle you and your dead as if they were our own, which they are. Already, the poppies seek solace in Flanders fields. Thank you.
At the risk, Susan was a nurse during Vietnam, and nurses were sometimes referred to as angels. Now I'd like to ask Francis Sullivan to come up. Come on up, Terry.
I have one challenge, and that is to not cry. Nobody else has yet. Speaking of nurses, this book, A Long Triage, that I'm in the process of writing, is dedicated to a nurse, the only nurse who died in Vietnam. Her name is Sharon Lane. Anyways, I was drafted in 1968. I had actually joined the Navy. A lot of people, I tell them that, they don't believe it because of the way things are supposed to be in the world. And in fact, I got on bus 3. Bus 4 went to Paris Island, and some guys were drafted into the Marines during those days. I graduated from Rockford High School in '66. This is a true story at this point. What I'm going to read today is a little different than what's in the book, because work in progress is what writing workshops are all about. So chapter 1 of A Long Triage. They called us rear echelon motherfuckers, or RIMPs for short, even when they knew our names. They were the grunts, infantry soldiers, fighting in the worst conditions of combat. We provided them support. They needed the support they needed for their missions. But since we weren't one of them, they treated us like shit. Not all of them, but enough of them to piss me off. You know the type, like the bullies we all had to deal with as kids out on the playgrounds and schoolyards when we were growing up. I learned this disappointing lesson on my first day in Vietnam as an American soldier during the war. We were supposed to be brothers in arms, fighting for a common cause in support of our country. Those days were 40 years ago, and I thought I'd put all my tribal animosity behind me and that my PTSD was under control. But I continue to see them and hear them, especially when I'm haunted by daydreams, nightmares, and flashbacks of my own close calls with death. At first, I hear a fluttering in my ears, always the fluttering. Then I hear the whistling, followed by a flash of light that blinds me. Sometimes I panic and dive to the ground. I'm frightened, waiting for the explosions I'm sure will follow. Oh, sorry. My heart pounds rapidly. Blood rushes to my head in pulsating, aching throbs, and my mind spins like a child's toy top. I'm back in Vietnam, cramped in a fetal position, waiting to die. Eventually, my mind clears. The pulsating throbs fade away, and but for a few exceptions, my life's resumed its normal course. I was prepared.
I usually not.
I've been having these episodes ever since my first psychotic break. The doctors call them startled reactions. They told me they're triggered by unexpected events. But this time, the worst of them all. The last thing I can remember before waking up in the recovery room at the hospital was arguing on the phone with Amy, the probation officer, who was about to violate my client's right to counsel by asking the judge to send my teenage client back to jail before I arrive in court. She said, "Attorney Sullivan, I can't wait for you to get here. It's Friday, and I have the afternoon off. I'll get someone else to cover your case. Don't bother coming. It'll be over before you get here." "Bullshit," I screamed into the phone. I could taste the anger burning my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was outraged. The fluttering and whistling of rockets and mortars punctured my ears. A pain exploded in my head, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was surrounded by a team of doctors. They said, "Mr. Sullivan, when you arrived by ambulance, your brain was hemorrhaging. We performed an emergency craniotomy but you emerged from the anesthesia in a state of delirium, screaming about grimps and grunts, incoming rockets and mortars and gooks coming through the wire. I said I thought I was back in Vietnam. My mind was spinning somewhere in the dark. I could hear the fluttering and whistling of the rockets and mortars. I felt myself flying through the air. When I felt someone slam into me, we hit the ground. I could taste the dirt filling my mouth as we landed. Then a flash of the biggest light, the brightest light I'd ever seen, blinded me. As my vision came back, I could see his hair turning from blonde to white. So they medicated me and added a psychiatrist to my team of caregivers. My rehabilitation and recovery included physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy for the brain injury and symptoms of stroke. In addition to the medications, psychotherapeutic writing exercises were recommended to help me with my PTSD. My goal became twofold. Not only did I need to get the reality of war into focus, I needed to purge myself of some deep-seated anger. My biggest problem has been keeping fantasy from merging with reality. My therapist said, "Mr. Sullivan, we want you to continue with therapy after we send you home from the hospital. I've read your medical history, and it concerns me. For the first 20 years after returning home, you lashed out in anger at the people around you while self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. You had a psychotic break and tried to kill yourself. We'd like to avoid having that happen again." So would I. And that, in that case, Mr. Sullivan, your first writing assignment for homework should be a description of your arrival in Vietnam. When I got home, I began to write and wrote until it hurt.
So I'd like to ask Martin Ray. Martin.
I was raised in the Army and went through ROTC, graduated from college in 1968, and spent 4 years in the Army, in the Corps of Engineers. The last year was in Vietnam. This piece partly integrates that background with my thoughts afterwards. Some years ago, I took time off from a peace witness in Washington to visit Arlington National Cemetery. From the hilltop in May, our capital stretched resplendently on the other side of the Potomac. A steady stream of planes flew in and out of view like worker bees feeding the colony from a global hinterland. Dogwoods and azaleas in full bloom comforted the fields of graves. Spring green lawns made the monuments look whiter than life. At the summit stood the Custis Lee Mansion, homestead of General Robert E. Lee, once the superintendent of West Point and a leader of the secessionist army. He married Mary Custis, the granddaughter of George Washington, and oversaw slaves tilling these fields opposite the Union Capitol. Congress sought to debase his name and plantation by expropriating the land as a burying ground for the Union dead in 1864. Nearby, I found my grandfather's gravestone. When he eulogized Father at a chapel gathering here, my dad invoked the long gray line of West Point graduates that framed both their lives, as well as that of Uncle Rod. Father's other two sons entered the National Service from the Naval Academy. In June of 1968, Father had attended my regular Army commissioning. Dad was there in uniform, 2 colonels, and a newly minted lieutenant. I visited Father 2 months later in East Moriches. He and Jean were closing the family homestead for the last time. He entrusted me with his dress saber, his Indian clubs, and the cast iron water pump that served the household when they first summered in rural Long Island. Dad called me a few weeks later. Father died while saying farewell to his pals in town the day they sold the house. he never made the move to Florida. Now, 30 years later, or so later, I stood before his gravestone as a pilgrim both to and from my past. I breathed out loud my first spoken prayer. Forgive me, Father, the ways I have disappointed you, and I will forgive you the way you have disappointed me. A small cloud crossed the perfect sky, streaking tears over the inscription on his stone. Father's 3 surviving sons inherited the other half of his cemetery plot. They agreed it should belong to Uncle Rod for his eventual interment. Uncle Rod, the baby of the family, wounded at Normandy, and the 3rd Colonel Ray. While I was taking care of Dad in the nursing home, he reminisced about Father's charge to him in 1939 to help prepare Rod for the West Point entrance exam. Dad took on his schoolboy brother as a summer orderly in the horse-drawn artillery at Fort Hoyle, Maryland. He assigned Rod a docile mare named Betty. When Rod died in 2007, Dad asked me to represent him at the Arlington service. I read the cadet prayer as he had at Father's funeral. I spoke his message. Rod and I have been brothers and close friends all our lives. In the past, I usually led to a meeting of significance or adventure. This time, Rod, you have beaten me to it. See you soon, pal. Family and friends followed the caisson from the chapel to the gravesite, escorted by the United States Army Band. Rod was accorded full ceremonial honors. A color guard folded the flag over his ashes and presented it to his widow. A bugler played taps. We witnessed the rededication of the nation to itself as one of its soldiers was laid to rest, a cherished defender of freedom, accorded hallowed ground. I looked back across the river. The planes continued to come and go. My country had said it needed me in Vietnam. People suffered, sacrificed, endured tedium, terror, and heroism. Mostly, I saw it as an immeasurable waste. I did not want to be thanked for my part. I looked across the river from the sacred ground of citizenship and the sacred ground of my soul. Like the bees, I was born for obedience to the hive, but also to question its choices. Thank you.
As you can see, some of these stories are tough for some of us to read. Now I'd like to ask Mark Levy to please come up and read Jaws. That's okay. Just speak directly into it, Mark. Thanks.
Okay. I was in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry as an infantry medic in 1970. And when I got back, I had a year left to do at Fort Sam. So I'd seen my share of combat. And that's good. The first day I got back, the first sergeant said, "You have guard duty." And I said, "No, I don't." And then a couple of weeks later, they said, "You have KP." And I said, I can't do that. And they said, "You need to get a haircut." And I said, "Not anymore." Then, not now. And then they said, "You need to salute officers." And I said, I can't do that either. So a couple of Article 15s, which are basically traffic tickets, and then 2 court-martials, and then I finally got out. Honorable discharge, general discharge. And here we are today. So I'm going to read 2 poems. This is called Just Another Day. That night, shell upon shell, each burst shuddering the fetid bunker, you shouting, get down, before all went bright. At dawn, the withering fire ended. Exhausted grunts reached in, fished about, hauled him into the light, lifeless head, pale hands, furrowing dry red dirt. While inside the foul pitch black, someone questioned, what is that? Recoiling back at the flash-lit gray-white thing everywhere red, then you and I fished the awful muck to buckets, in sunlight, careful not to look, not breathe, not think, to ask his name. And that night, every night, hoping only to forget. This is called 45 Days. Toss me a grenade, he shouts, so I do that. He pulls the pin, ping, he counts 3, throws the thing, boom, they must be dead. But now the dreads snap their Chicom makes when they pull the string to activate the chemical fuse in the wood handle that flies from the wood line, falls short, twists the machine gun. Wilson, Dorio, Roy, Beck raise up. Wilson yells, look to the left, they'll try to outflank us. So I do that. The grunts shoot back, then snap, bang, dirt and dust, everyone hit. After the medevacs lift them away, after we recon for blood trails and meat, we leave this place. Patrols, jungle, ambush, monsoon. Not how we wanted, not how we dreamed. No pop smoke in the open field for birds inbound to lift us out. No cooling air till the birds touch down. None of that. All day we trudge the dark, wet trails, slip and climb the muddy hills, wade the dark and narrow streams, step so weary, with one last heave we drop our rucks into the killing heat and curse you, love you, Vietnam. Vietnam. Thank you.
Ruth Olson, the wife of Mel Olson, will read from his work. Is she here today? Yes, please come up. Where are you? Come on up. Over there. Come up.
I'm Ruth Olson, and this is my granddaughter, Jessica Olson, and she's my understudy if I need it. And Mr. Fina, I don't think you mentioned Gregg's hardware store. Mel worked in Gregg's all through high school and before he went into the service. Mel has written a book called Our Army Life about his brother, his twin brother, Frenchie. And that was at the recommendation of his daughter, Deborah. So when he went to the writing class, he extended more about what actually happened during the fighting. So I'm going to read, or try to read, a piece of it. One evening, the entire front erupted with bugles, shepherd horns, and whistles blowing. This was a major attack. We immediately got fire missions from all units. That night took on the appearance of a 4th of July celebration, during which a terrific electrical storm. You could look in any direction and see a flicker as artillery fired everywhere, everything they had. Our battalion expended over 9,000 rounds on the Chinese that night. The Chinese blew thousands of crack troops in a human wave assault. Now our infantry was passing through our positions going south. That was a bad sign. The infantry is supposed to be in front of the artillery. It was referred to as the big bug-out. Units were retreating, leaving their equipment behind them, and running. We really couldn't blame them. We probably would have done the same thing. We were ordered out of the position, and then we got orders to set up again and stay behind, and fire missions so that the 24th Infantry Division could withdraw. The Chinese got about 50 yards from us. That was about a half a football field across the river. When the Chinese were recovering from the shock of the bombardment, then we were able to get out of there. At this point, the weather was down to about 0 degrees. The gun mounts were frozen to the ground, and the gun commanders were ready to put the thermite grenades down the gun tubes and blow them apart. Things did not look very good. The battalion commander called the battery commanders and said that this could be Custer's last stand, and you guys are Custer. It sure was not a good sign for the battery commanders or the men. Then we heard that the 8th Cavalry Regiment, which came up to cover our exposed flank, was overrun and practically wiped out. A lieutenant in our battery opened up boxes of grenades and ran along the perimeter saying, "Feed them pineapples, they love them." So we hurled grenades into the woods at the Chinese. After some time, I said, "Where's my brother?" Somebody said he saw him going up a small hill. I went charging up the hill and found him on a machine gun post with 2 South Korean soldiers, and Frenchie asked what was going on. I yelled, "All hell has broken loose, and the Chinese are about 10 or 15 minutes away, and we are trapped and surrounded." We raced down the hill and started to vacate our positions. The gun crews were able to free the gun mount, so we jumped into the trucks and fell back. The infantry and a lot more of the retreating troops jumped onto our trucks too. A guy in our infantry repeated over and over, "We're not going to make it, we're not going to make it." We didn't need that and told him to shut up. We experienced Chinese roadblocks along our escape route, but were able to reach Anzhou. The roads were cluttered with wrecks of vehicles. Our bulldozer operator was ordered to clear the road of everything and proceed. We were averaging about 5 miles an hour. We were very lucky that we only had a few casualties and did not lose any equipment. Our battery commander looked through his binoculars and could see the Chinese going through the positions that we had just left. Now the weather was turning colder. We still weren't issued any winter gear. All we had was summer clothing, which consisted of summer pants, shirts, socks, and regular combat boots. Near the end of November 1950, it got to 30 and 40 degrees below 0. We put layers and layers of summer clothing on. Then we set up the parachutes as teepees, which at least broke the wind, but on guard duty and fire missions, it was miserably cold. One thing we always said about Korea was the weather. You had snow, sub-freezing temperatures, and the Siberian winds. We would wake up and had to brush the snow and frost off of our sleeping bags. The only good thing about the extreme cold is that it saved many lives because the blood would coagulate fast and it prevented many soldiers from bleeding to death. The medics would put the plasma under their armpits so that it would not freeze. One of the best descriptions of the cold came from a lieutenant of the 2nd Infantry Division. He said, "It was unimaginable military hell. Hills turned out to be mountains, winds blowing even harder, temperatures dropping almost by the hour. Every day was bitterly cold, except that the next day would be colder and make you long for the cold of yesterday." Would you do the last part?
Yeah. After we were home a while, we noticed our mother's head was shaking quite a bit. We asked her about it, and she said it had been like that for over a year. We took it to the doctor, but he could not find out what was wrong. Finally, the doctor made an appointment to see a specialist at Mass General in Boston. After numerous tests, the specialist determined that it was as if she had been in Korea with us and treated her as if she had shell shock, just like the other patients. She also lost her sense of smell because of all the stress and never regained it. She kept to herself while we were in Korea and did not want to mingle or talk to anyone about Korea. She constantly went to St. Anne's every day to pray for us. People said that she wore a path from the house to the church. Frenchie and I honestly believe that through her prayers and devotion, God was looking over us. The shaking in her head gradually let up. And even in her later years, we could still see her shaking just a little.
Now I'd like to ask Maria Lane to come up, who will be reading for George Lane.
I'm Maria Lane, and for the better part of 40 years, my dad has talked to me about his experience in the Korean War. It's an honor to be here, as it has been to be part of the Veterans Writing Workshop. I met Mel Olson in it. He showed me a map where he and his twin brother Al, or Frenchie, were in North Korea, southwest of where my father was at the same time in November 1950, during the northernmost battles in the Korean War. What are the chances? To the Chosen and back. When my father, George Edward Lane, joined the Marines at 17, it was post-World War II, peacetime. What he couldn't know was that the dynamics between East and West would become the Cold War, pitting former allies against each other when North Korea, backed by Russia, would invade South Korea on the 27th of June, 1950. He had completed 4 years of service and enrolled in college in Boston when he was frozen in place. The United Nations Security Council resolved to restore peace. The U.S. was to lead a multinational force to enforce the resolution. My father was in the 1st Marine Division, 7th Regiment, part of the UN X-Corps. He did not speak of the war until I was 18. The only sign I saw of it was a photograph of 160 men in his Marine Division at Camp Pendleton, California, before boarding ship for Korea. It was another world away from the one we lived in, with ocean breezes and sunlit granite shores of our home in Lanesville. Only 10% of those men would survive. In an excerpt of a letter to my grandmother, my father wrote, "Dearest Mom, we're aboard an LST ship in Incheon Harbor. We're going to Wonsan in North Korea. Our lieutenant has managed to get a hold of some Newsweek magazines. What amazes me is how they talk of the war being over, that Seoul had fallen on September 26th, but it would have been hard convincing me. I was in combat, lying on a bank in Seoul, watching a string of machine gun bullets kicking up the dirt next to me and wondering if the next ones would be down my back. Did I tell you I planned to get a car? Have a 1950 all-steel station wagon in mind with a radio, of course. One thing I'm sure of is I'm going to school. Your loving son, Eddie. P.S. Don't worry." My father traveled north, the tip of the spear, to the Battle of Chosen Reservoir, one of the most renowned in Marine Corps annals. 12,000 Marines and a few thousand Army struggled to survive the coldest winter in 100 years. It was so cold that blood froze. My father related the story many times to me about traveling to the Chosen. We took a hill in North Korea, going toward Lake Busan, a high plateau where the winter was one hell of a thing, 30 degrees below zero. We were the front line. We were it. It was hilly with big boulders, and we were coming on this foxhole where there was a young Chinese guy, standing up trying to figure out what was going on. There he was with his weapon. This fellow wasn't older than me. I dropped a grenade on him. My buddy was about to go forward, and I held him back. I just happened to think of his young face. It just told me how goddamn stupid war is. Funny what I remember, a grenade killing this kid. I thought, what am I doing? His mother would get a message that her son was dead. My father's comrade would have been killed. He saved one life while he took another. The scene played out over and over in his mind, as I have heard from many veterans of the terrible choice to kill or to be killed. It speaks to me of their deep humanity. My father said, we reached the plateau. It was a slaughterhouse. There were bodies of soldiers stacked like cordwoods in trucks. The 1st Marine Division, outnumbered 10-1, was threatened with extinction. Surrounded by Chinese soldiers, their only lifeline was a steep mountain road, a 78-mile journey to the Sea of Japan. The withdrawal was the longest in American military history. They also brought 90,000 North Korean civilians out with them. After being trapped in the retreat and fighting, my father reached safety with injured legs and severe frostbite. He was 21. He recovered in a Navy hospital ship in Japan. He wrote to his father, Dad, boy, all my buddies are either maimed or killed. Can't understand it. My guardian angel must be on the ball. Scholarship has put the full battle death toll on all sides at just over 1.2 million, 10% of Korea's population, over 36,000 American deaths in just 3 years, and 8,000 missing in action. My father said there are no winners in war. Today, 28,000 American soldiers are present at the 38th parallel in an uneasy existence. It is as if the war never ended. My father went home to Boston, attended the Museum of Fine Arts School, became a sculptor and teacher, and married my mother, Christine Cox. We moved to Gloucester, her hometown. With its beauty and rich cultural community, he felt it was heaven on earth. He made the plaque that is on the side of this building, commemorating Howard Blackburn and his single-handed sail across the Atlantic without fingers lost to frostbite at sea. War is not over when it ends. Violence and mayhem stay with the soldiers and civilians who live on the line between life and death and reverberate beyond, affecting all of us in the world. Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to World War II. Mary Conley, could you come up, please?
I have lived in Gloucester for 45 years. I was raised in Cambridge. What prompted me to join Dorothy's writing class held at the Veterans Center was finding in my family's attic letters written by my older brothers, Tom and Jimmy, from the battlefields of Italy and North Africa during World War II. This excerpt I am going to read from my story is about Tom's return to civilian life after losing his leg in battle and becoming a prisoner of war. The title of my story, Tom, I Hardly Knew You. Tom returned from World War II in 1945. Our family and all the neighbors were happy to see him home. The whole country was excited that the war was over and the military were returning home. When all of the excitement quieted down, everyone went back to work, resuming their normal life. Yet, many discharged from the military tried to resume their civilian life, but could not. As I reflect on Tom's life, he loved baseball, always in the baseball park, organized the Cambridge Cardinals, was captain, and a great catcher. His dream was to sign up with the Boston Braves baseball team. When he returned home with one leg, he never picked up his glove again. I realized the heavy drinking must have helped Tom block out the terrible battles he experienced. His leg was blown off. Many of his buddies were laying dead. The Germans captured him, amputated his leg at a first aid hospital with little anesthesia. He then was transported to a prison hospital camp in Dresden, Germany. After about 3.5 months, he was repatriated for German prisoners of war in Switzerland. My second reading is an excerpt from the story titled, Sarah Comes Home. Sarah is my mother, who came to this country when she was 16 years old. The picture of Sarah's dear mother standing on the dock, waving to her children, saying, God bless you, haunted my mother so much. She saved enough money working in a chocolate factory for passage to Ireland to visit her. Sarah boarded the big ocean liner docked in Boston to Ireland. As the days passed, while walking along the deck, her thoughts were focused on her return trip to Ireland. How was her mother? Has she aged much? Her favorite goat, Daisy, still giving milk? Is her bike still in the barn so she can travel about? After several days at sea, she arrived in Londonderry, North Ireland. She traveled to the town of Fina by a horse-driven van. Oh, it was so good to see the beautiful green hills and the sheep grazing along the way. She got off in town, walked up to the crossroad. She began to walk faster, her heart beating with anxiety. Coming up the lane, she met a girl, her sister Teresa. She hardly recognized her. She had grown up. As she reached the cottage, peered over the half door, she saw her mother sitting at the table with a cup of tea. Her beautiful auburn hair almost white, her pace a little slower with arthritis. Oh, she was so happy to see Sarah. And Sarah was happy to be home with her brothers, sisters, and friends. Thank you.
Okay, our next reader is Virginia Fontero McKinnon.
I'll begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I started to write because I realized it was at the time my father's youngest sibling died, and my mother's remaining sisters were no longer able to tell the old family stories. So I joined the memoir group at the senior center, and I began to write family stories. My mother was only 4 months old when she arrived in America from Sicily with my grandmother. That was in 1910. So I attended the open mic. It was the first Monday of the month at the Gloucester Writers Center. And I also, to tell some of my stories there. And then I attended the very first Fishtails, and that was 5 years ago. They just celebrated a 5th anniversary. And I was the original writer in residence, and I was just telling Maureen that she gave me a wandering Jew plant because she says it took off like my stories, and it's taken over my whole living room. and then the Fishtail stories are told on Channel 12 on TV, and many of you probably have seen them. The last one was on birth, and I told the story of how I had 7 children by my 10th wedding anniversary, and my sister Mary Ann said I should be a stand-up comedian to tell the story like that. So then when I saw the ad about this Gloucester, the Cape Ann Veterans Workshop, I thought it'd be a good time to write some of my husband's war stories. So I thought it was just for veterans, and I asked Henry, can I attend the workshop so I can write this? He says, oh, of course you can. So that was great. And I just, Dorothy has been very, very dedicated to us. She's just a wonderful teacher, and I can't thank them enough for all they've done for me. And so I did, during the workshop, I presented Dorothy with my collection of about 40 short stories, and she said, well, that's enough for a book. And I says, I've got to include all my family. That's not enough. I've got a big family. I have to keep writing. So I'm hoping by next year I'll have my book written, and then you can all come to my book launch. So the story I'm going to tell is about my husband. He was in World War II. It's a one sailor story. I didn't meet my husband, Robert McKinnon, until April of 1953. He would relate to me some of his stories of World War II, telling me he was drafted into the United States Navy, and after basic training, he left the continental limits of the United States in June of 1943 for the Asiatic Pacific Campaign. At age 18, he had never been this far away from home. Well, Robert witnessed the disaster of Westlock in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on May 22, 1944. There were 29 LSTs, the landing ship transports, and they were nestled together ready to invade Saipan. Luckily, Robert's commanding officer ordered him off his ship. He was on the LCT, a landing craft transport, a smaller ship that was on top of the LST. Well, something went wrong. The explosion occurred on the bow of his ship, where Army troops were unloading motor ammunition. He watched as 6 LSTs blew up and sank. For 24 hours, fire raged aboard the stricken ships. The explosion threw body parts and chunks of wood and metal hundreds of feet. Over 100 men died and hundreds were wounded. 200 buildings were damaged. The Westlock disaster was veiled in secrecy for 60 years as not to compromise the United States' coming invasion of Saipan. In fact, this book was just published this year, and they're finally recognizing this Westlock disaster. And my son heard about it on the it was on television back in 2005, and he was so excited. He called and he spoke to his dad. He says, "Dad," he says, "you know, they're talking about the West Loch disaster on TV. They're finally telling about it." Now, no one believed Robert. No one believed him when he talked about the horrors he had witnessed in the other battles that he was into. He had nightmares of seeing so many of his friends killed. It took a fire to resurrect these deeply repressed memories. In January of 2005, Robert suffered third-degree burns on 20% of his body in a home accident. He woke after skin graft surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, screaming that his ship was on fire. He was diagnosed by several psychiatrists, finally diagnosed with post-traumatic syndrome. He was prescribed medication to help him cope with his anxiety. And he spent many months of weekly visits to the Gloucester Veterans Center, seeing a very understanding veteran therapist. I worry about all the servicemen in harm's way today. Will their tragic experiences be understood? Will they also have nightmares and secret memories? I can only write about my own observations of painful memories and what war can do to a person. Veterans carry many secret burdens. I believe when a young man goes to war, the same person does not return. Attending classes at the Gloucester Veterans Writing Workshop for the past 4 years, I'm amazed at the number of war veterans who cry when telling of their war experiences. The hurt never goes away. Well, then I'd like to read just something a little different this afternoon, a little story about my dad, and it's called A Gloucester Fisherman's Daughter. My dad, Mike Frontero, was a Gloucester fisherman. He had many tales to tell. I remember Dad taking a big piece of paper with a pencil in hand. He would draw and explain the process of catching fish to me. He would begin by drawing a picture of his boat, a dragger, the winch, the doors, the steel cables, and the net. March 14, 1949, my mom was listening to her ship-to-shore shortwave radio, and she heard the voice of the skipper, Busty Serial, warning, "Mayday, Mayday, the fishing vessel America was taken on water and sinking." With the rosary beads in hand, she prayed for my dad's safe return. The 8-man crew were taken aboard by nearby fishing boats. My dad was the engineer. He and the skipper remained in the boat, pumping water desperately, trying to save the 71-foot America. The Coast Guard arrived and explained to my dad that the America could not be saved, and they had to abandon ship. My dad said, as they were leaving, he witnessed a huge funnel hole appear in the ocean, and the America was sinking into this hole. The current was so strong, the Coast Guard boat was having difficulty from being drawn into this hole and into the ocean. And you can read the rest of the story in the book.
So next up is Connie. Connie Condon, please.
First of all, let me tell you, I've been a resident of Gloucester since 1967. I am the daughter of a naval veteran, the wife of a Marine veteran, and the mother of an Army veteran. I am a registered nurse, a mother, a grandmother, an actress, a writer, and God only knows what else. Not necessarily, oh yeah, I'm a Democrat. Not necessarily in that order. So, I'm not like everyone else. You see, I didn't bring the prepared papers. I have to read from the book. During World War II, people seemed so much more involved in what was going on than what they are today. In World War II, many houses had a star hanging in the window, while today you would have to hunt to find one. Food, sugar, beef, butter, and gas were rationed. Children were often sent to stand in line with the ration books for these items. Most people didn't have cars, as I recall. Transportation by bus and train was prevalent. Every town had a collection bin on the sidewalk made out of chicken wire formed into a circle. It could usually be found in front of the city or town hall. People put odd pieces of metal, old pans and tools, utensils and such things into the bin. I remember people taking the tin foil from gum and saving it and wadding it into a ball to contribute to the collection. All local service bases and airports were in full operation. Children played Japs and Americans instead of cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians. They had to take turns because everyone wanted to be the Americans. They were children and didn't fully understand war. Movies were accompanied by world news and cartoons. Many movies were made depicting stories about war, the way loved ones were left alone as husbands were off fighting, for example. Rosie the Riveter came into being as women had to cover shifts in the factories. Often children took care of themselves within reason. They knew how to make their lunch, heat up canned soup, make sandwiches, prepare cereal, and more. The soft drinks were Coke and Moxie, and of course Kool-Aid if sugar was an option. Water was good, not filled with chemicals like it is today. There were blackouts when a fire whistle was sounded, and then whole towns and cities became all lights out in preparation for an enemy air attack. Doctors made house calls, and the word cancer was rarely heard. Most people did not have a phone, and the ones who did were on what was called the party line. 4 people, maybe more, shared the same line. There were phone operators who connected you to the people you wanted to call. You could easily get someone's phone number from an operator. There were no TVs, cell phones, iPads, computers, or police and fire department scanners. People did not practice CPR or the Heimlich maneuver. Children played outside usually until the streetlights came on, and they read books, including comic books. No one hired babysitters. Family members, mainly grandparents, took care of the children. People had ice boxes. There were delivery trucks for baked goods and milk. Were there supermarkets? I'm not sure. I remember small grocery stores. As a child, I really didn't understand the war, and I'm sure most other children didn't either. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of life then. When that happens, I watch the Waltons on TV. At the same time, I marvel at what has come about in the last 70 years. I do not want to go back to those earlier times, but I do want to remember. I'm going to read another piece. Memories of Ellen Condon. I pull over in my car on a bright day in the town of Danvers, Mass. My sister-in-law, Ellen Condon, is waiting in the doorway for me. I know she is ready, but I do a quick scan anyways. Are her clothes clean and neat? Is her hair combed? Has she inserted her teeth? I ask if she has her keys, and did she take her meds? My sister-in-law has early Alzheimer's disease. I think back now to how we met. My boyfriend, Bob, of 3 months, picked me up one night and said, "We're going to meet with my brother Everett and his wife Ellen and go out for pizza." It was a nice evening, and Ellen and I remained friends over the years. She and Evie started their family with their son Stevie, and Bob and I would babysit. As the years went by, they had 4 more children, and Bob and I got married and had 3 children of our own. Tragedies hit both of our families. Our youngest son, Michael, was diagnosed with cancer and died at age 16. The worst experience for Ellen was when her son accidentally overdosed and died. I don't think Ellen ever really got over that. Patrick was such a lovable and friendly person, and Ellen had to make the decision to pull the plug. Patrick was 47 years old. In later years, my husband Bob and Ellen's husband Evie passed away. She is smiling and clearly so happy to see me, and I am grateful that she still knows who I am. Her family has taken her car away, and now Meals on Wheels comes Monday through Friday, and a home health aide stops by twice a week. Her daughter and granddaughter live with her, but the daughter works full-time. She resents that someone comes by regularly to check on her and says her only problem is that her memory is not good. I weep silently as I see how she has begun to fail, and not only because of memory loss. Her home has become unkempt, for example, and that is not like her. At the restaurant, she is unable to decide what to order and wants to know what marinara sauce is. Since Ellen was a registered dietitian at a local hospital until retirement, this is troubling. I have learned that a buffet works best for her as she sees the food and can more easily decide what to get. She still talks about our excursion earlier this summer when I took her out for the 2-hour cruise, which included dinner. She had such a nice time. I try to see her at least every couple of weeks, but it doesn't always happen. Calling her now and then is all I am able to do most of the time. She always asks me about my kids and my husband, Bob. I do not tell her that Bob has died. I just pretend he is still alive and say he's good. She's been known to leave the house in the middle of the night with a robe on and no slippers. There are other incidents that make me wonder how long she'll be able to stay at home. Years ago, the 4 of us rented a cottage on Lake Winnipesaukee together and had many good times. When I tell Ellen stories about our New Hampshire outings and vacations, she remembers them and laughs. Back then, Bob and I and Ellen and Evie went out to dinner and the movies often. We had been friends for so long that the occasions we enjoyed together remained fresh in my memory. To see her the way she is now is very painful for me. I bring her home and get her settled. She hugs me and says thank you. I take my leave and cry on the way home as I remember how things used to be. By Christmas 2015, Ellen was admitted to an assisted care facility. Her grandson had accidentally, fatally overdosed in her basement. She was not told about this tragedy and was taken away before the emergency people arrived. I went to see her a few times and even took her out to lunch. However, on the return, she said, "I do not live here." On the pretense of saying we were going to visit a friend, she went in. Once inside, the personnel took over. I knew then that there would be no more takeaways. I continued to visit her, and recently my son came with me. We brought her a lunch of lobster rolls filled with large chunks of lobster. The rolls tasted like the ocean and were delicious. Ellen enjoyed the lunch so much, and although she did not know my son or me, she talked and laughed with us. As painful as it was that she did not know us, I have to recognize that she seems quite happy, and that is good. Now that she is residing in the assisted living facility, she seems content, and that is all we can ask for. My memories are my treasures. Thank you.
You know, that completes the part on World War II, and we're entering into widening circles, and we have Linda next.
I joined the veterans writing class a couple years ago. My aunt, who I focus on, was in the Marine Reserves. Her name was Dorothy May Graves. She was a skier in the 1930s and 40s, and often the only woman competing. My mother went with her for a few years, and they competed together as a sensation sisters. But my mother hurt herself, and but my aunt continued. This is from the Dorothy May Graves Speaks, which is in the booklet that you should purchase. It's an excerpt, and this part is as if she is speaking. My life started in 1923 in Greenfield, Mass, in a small area called Bingville, named after the noisy trolleys that took people around town. When I was 7, I got scarlet fever. Children had died from it in the 1920s, but I was fortunate enough that antibiotics were available in 1930. However, the disease had weakened my muscles, so my father got an idea of how to strengthen them. He taught my older sister and I how to cross-country ski. He knew a carpenter who made the skis, and then our father attached old rubber from worn-out tires for bindings. You might say we were off to the races. We loved skiing in the woods near our home, and one fate-filled day, my father created a small hill in the middle of our path, and my sister and I were airborne for a second. Eventually, our dad was designated as the head person to oversee the building of the first ski jump in Massachusetts. Since he also had worked on the railroad, any discarded wood from the tracks being laid were taken to the work site for the ski jump. My sister and I did eventually compete at that jump. I was 12 when I first entered a ski jumping competition. Since ski jumping had not really taken off for women here in the States, my sister and I were known to rank at the top with other women in the world in our early teens. We were also referred to as the sister sensations. I was more focused on beating my own record. As an older adult, I was honored to have an award named in my honor. I attended several of these events and met some wonderful young women jumpers. They would have been considered junior jumpers. Before leaving this earthly plane in 2005, I had handed the Dorothy Graves Award 4 years in a row to Lindsay Vann, who became one of the first women ski jumpers on the first U.S. Olympic ski team, jumping team, that competed in the 2014 Games in Sochi, Russia, and is now a coach for the team. Did you remember that earlier date, 1924? Yes, it took 90 years from the time ski jumping was part of the first Winter Olympics to when females were allowed to have teams and jump. This is from Dorothy Graves 14 at Laconia, New Hampshire. When it's finally Dorothy's turn, she feels absolutely frozen for a moment, as if time and space have stopped as well. While still under the heavy canopy at the top, she raises her head toward her impending future and nods to the storm as if to say, "You can't stop me now." When the judge says, "Now," Dorothy takes off down the snow-packed jump. Time again seems to stand still, yet she is still moving toward that future, challenging and unknown. The wind seems to lift her higher than usual, although she can feel her face freezing with each forward movement. When she hears that familiar whack of her skis, she holds on to her balance, and a breath of air releases from her inner being. The crowd, bundled up in automobile blankets, is silent. Then, as a few recognize a contestant, they begin cheering and clapping with their covered hands. A few are shaking their heads, and some appear to be in shock as they are whispering, "It's a girl." This is an excerpt from the epilogue of the Dorothy Graves story. Spring has arrived in western Massachusetts, but small patches of snow can be seen in shadier areas like at the cemetery. Robert thinks of walking to the cemetery from town, as he knows where it is, but then decides he shouldn't be using what little energy he has. So he gets into his small SUV and turns the key. Under the railroad bridge leading into the country, then past the fairgrounds, he takes a turn onto the dirt road, to an area he only saw a few times as a child. There are numberless numbers of plates of stone and the name of each honoree carved into them. The sun has not been able to make its debut due to the heavy cloud cover. Robert is aware of every sound heat or nature makes. A crow flies from the top of a distant shed, heads toward him, then veers off toward a brownish field. He then notices his own breathing and how heavy his feet and legs feel. A slight wind chills his ears and cheeks. He is coming to terms with being older, his body less flexible. Then he finds the site where a rectangular hole has been dug and is covered with a green plastic sheet. No flowers adorn the four edges. The writing on the stone is accurate, just the basic facts. Dorothy May Graves, March 1st, 1923 to March 24th, 2005. 23 days after a small birthday party for her at his home, and she left forever. No more brief advice or questions about taxes or inquiries about his sons or wife or brother or anything. This is a poem, and there is a picture in the book of her, the back of her, taking off. It's called The Odd Bird. I look for her spirit in a woman who wears a patterned sweater with a winter design in the corner at a small wooden table. Coffee, plain and black, staring back, and she staring in. Thinking of home, her first coffee a shock, her sister's death a complete shock, and her mother leaving, not walking out, just not present in the present. I look for her challenges when I see children who strive to learn how to read, to learn the multiplication tables, understand algebra, certain sign charts, and well, to survive the playground. Befriending the innocent, the boy with thick glasses and buck teeth, her athletic abilities beyond his, yet showing him how to bat, kick the ball harder, shoo away bullies and hurtful comments. I look for her flying, not in airplanes nor with hang gliders, oh, never those things, but for her form at the top of the mountain, poised to leave at the right moment, at her moment, to flying down a wooden slide, with a winter wind attempting to stall her form, prevent her lunge, yet lunge she would, and for all times, and being the best possible jumper anywhere in the world, in her town, state, and country. I miss her spirit, I miss her.
I'd like to have some final words. Francis Abram, will you please come up?
Hi. Hi, my name is Francis Abram, and I'm an Army veteran. Go Army! Yay! Yes. My father was. Yeah, 2 in a row. My father was an Army veteran, as were my uncles, World War II. And I served as a medical sergeant in the mid-1960s with the 6th Special Forces Group out of Fort Bragg. And I'm going to read a part from Tom Seraphin. He was a member of the writing group and died suddenly this February at 68 years old. And I miss him. He was a friend of mine, as well as a lot of veterans. Tom's article is The Importance of Military Stories. Telling stories about our military experiences can be a personal healing, therapeutic experience. It allows the storyteller to air difficult emotions, feelings, and knowledge about life-changing wartime events. Sharing military stories can be enlightening for the listener. The stories offer insight about the storyteller and at the same time provide details on specific wartime occurrences that enhance our understanding. To quote from an editorial in April of 2016 from the Gloucester Daily Times, World War I has done more to shape our modern world than any other event of the 20th century. If you believe this statement, how important is it that we listen and gain a better understanding of the effects of war has on our daily lives? To quote again from this editorial, history is important, if for nothing more than understanding how we got to where we are. The history of war and the personal stories and experiences we share help us to better understand the world around us. The past, especially the military past of the last 100 years, is extremely relevant. World wars and all the other wars and conflicts continue to have a dramatic impact on the world we live in today. I agree with the points made in the editorial mentioned above. Meddling in the Middle East since the end of World War I has played a major role in today's international tensions. Thank you.
One more thing about Tom. On Fridays, there's the coffee for veterans at the Veterans Center in the morning. And Tom was always there with his boisterous self, bringing the donuts and bringing the coffee and making sure everything was there. He is sorely missed by all of us. Now, Charles Steiner, I'd like to ask you to come up for a few closing words. Charles, try to speak directly into the mic, okay? Try to speak directly into
I was privileged to go to the Veterans Center under Dorothy Nelson, but I had a very moving experience. Virginia wrote a story that moved me, and I will never forget. And it was a story that she told about her grandmother speaking to her as a small child. And I want to read what it said. Last year, the Veterans Writing Workshop, there was a presentation that continually plays on the turntable of my mind. I'm referring to a story of a grandmother being questioned by her grandchild, who was curious about how her elder relative came to Gloucester from Sicily. The tale itself was very poignant, describing the conditions and customs of Sicily in the 19th century. The matriarch recounts to her grandchild how she dutifully waited for years for a letter summoning her to America. The granddaughter was puzzled as to why her beloved grandmother would wait so long, and what assurance did she have the letter would ever arrive. The reply stunned the granddaughter, and I believed everyone who told the story. She said, "He promised." That short narrative brings to mind the loss of reliability in one's words in these times, the loss of a handshake, the seal of a deal, the confidence that punctuality will be honored, the wondrous notion that one's word was his bond. Thank you, Virginia.
Okay, Dorothy would like all the writers that are still here to please stand up.